Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew.
It's a high-stakes day here in Washington. We are moments away from President Trump greeting the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy at the White House. Welcome to the second hour of the Monday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Tyler Kendall here in Washington alongside Bloomberg's Michael Shepard. Joe Matthew is off. We have a busy afternoon ahead, and we'll bring you all of the updates, all of the developments, as we've now seen about half a dozen European leaders, Mike, enter into the White House, including the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. The list really goes on and on here ahead of
choreography.
Right, exactly. We're seeing them start to flood into the White House. If you're joining us on radio right now, we have a shot up right in front of the West Wing as we wait for Zelenskyy to arrive.
And he is really the guest of honor, if you will, at this moment. He is going to be hearing from President Donald Trump in person about the steps forward following President Trump's meeting with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, in Anchorage last week. The goal from all sides really, of course, is to end the war in Ukraine, but the terms are going to be very different, Tyler, based on what we've heard emerging from that meeting between Trump and Putin Friday, and what we have heard since coming from European leaders and most certainly Volodymyr Zelenskyy. There is a great concern that Donald Trump may be giving away too much and falling too much for some of the talking points and goals even of Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Right, we're going to get into all of it here in our next hour. We'll be joined by Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, a senior editor who covers the White House, as President Trump says that it is now on Ukraine to make a deal. And we'll also be joined by Rebecca Grant, vice president at the Lexington Institute, for all the latest on this conflict, Mike.
Yep, Tyler.
And for more now, we're going to get a check on how the markets are watching today's news. So we go to Charlie Pellet in New York for an update. Charlie?
Thank you very much, Tyler and Michael. We have got stocks lower. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. S&P right now down 6, drop there of 0.1%. The Dow flat on the day, lower by 7 points, unchanged essentially. NASDAQ lower now by 0.2%. Wall Street focused right now on geopolitics and, of course, unfolding developments at the White House. 10-year at 4.33%. Spot gold flat on the day, down 0.1%, down $3 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%, 63.10 a barrel. Sources tell Bloomberg the Trump administration is in discussions to take a stake of about 10% in Intel. Intel right now down by 4.4%. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Back we go to Washington. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your hosts, Tyler Kendall and Michael Shepard.
All right, Charlie Pellet from World Headquarters in New York for us. Thank you so much. Of course, our top story today is the meeting, the high-stakes meeting unfolding at the White House. The European leaders are already there, and we are moments away from the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy from arriving. If you're joining us on radio right now, we have a picture up. It shows the honor guard flanking the entrance into the Oval Office as we wait for this meeting to begin. And joining us now with the view from the White House is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, a senior editor for here who covers all things Washington for us. And Wendy, I want to start right here because the last time that Zelenskyy was in the Oval Office, it didn't go so well.
That didn't go so well.
That meeting ended up devolving. There was a shouting match. It ended earlier. What are we expecting from today? How could this be different from what we saw the last time Zelenskyy was there?
Well, first, this time he sort of brought backup with him, which is most of the leaders of Western Europe. They will not be in the meeting with him. They're having a separate brief meeting with President Trump afterwards. But also, this will be a chance for Zelenskyy to finally really get a sense of what happened in Alaska last Friday and find out whether any of these terms are even wildly acceptable to him. I mean, what we believe right now is that what Zelenskyy will be presented with is an impossible choice to give up territory, which the Ukrainian constitution forbids and is politically and in every other way bad for Ukraine, in exchange for some vague security guarantees that Steve Witkoff laid out on the Sunday shows yesterday, some Article 5-like guarantees, but no NATO membership, which these are what Putin wants. And Trump tweeted this morning, or made a social media post this morning that it's now in Zelenskyy's court. So who knows? It could end up devolving into a shouting match again, but we hope not.
Wendy, you were on the story all weekend long, and thank you for your efforts, of course, on that. But tell us how it's evolved since Friday, since the meeting between the two leaders. The storyline seems to have shifted, and what emerged seemed to have shifted and reshaped and maybe was reframed on the Sunday shows and even into this morning. Talk about that evolution.
Sure, and still not a lot of clarity because they, as you know, on Friday they had a news conference where they didn't really say anything, took no questions. Each went to their respective capitals. And then on Saturday, Steve Witkoff, the special envoy to Russia, played golf with Trump. We didn't hear anything from really either of them. Then on the Sunday shows, Witkoff comes out and announces this security guarantee plan as if it were a done deal. What is strange in the arc of presidencies, but sort of typical for this administration, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who was also in the room with Witkoff and Trump and Putin, came out with a completely different story on different networks, saying that this is in no way a done deal, that this is something the president might decide. And of course, we might want to ask Volodymyr Zelenskyy about it. And it's all very undone. So now, again, the ball is in, as I said, in Zelenskyy's court to kind of take this plan or leave it, and then we have to see how Europe responds.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned Europe because, of course, we should talk about some of the optics that we're seeing play out here today, because some of these leaders, I think it's fair to say President Trump has a relatively warmer relationship with, right? I'm thinking about the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the first to ink a trade deal with the US, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, one of the first European leaders invited to the White House after President Trump's inauguration. How could that potentially temper what we see happen here at the Oval Office today?
Well, I think and Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, who Trump also has a pretty good relationship with. The rest, not so much, I think we should say. But it sort of depends, I think, on whether they were able to help him or talk to him before the meeting, or whether what they're going to hear after the meeting. I think, Trump is one of those leaders who often listens to the last person he spoke to. And so we'll see how it goes with them after the meeting. They're all going to have a family photo. They'll all be smiling. And then they're all going home tonight. So I'm sure we'll hear from them as the evening wears on. And I'm pretty confident we'll hear from the president as well. And we'll just have to see, again, how Zelenskyy reacts to all of this.
Wendy, do we have any sense of what the next steps after today might look like? Would they be proceeding to another meeting with Vladimir Putin? Yes,
that's what Trump and I think Putin were hoping for after this meeting, is to set up within a week a trilateral meeting among the three of them, Trump, Putin, and Zelenskyy. Those meetings usually take a lot longer to set up because the staff has to pregame what's going to happen, and everything is just left to be signed. But the way these guys are operating this time, they're going to decide in a room on the spot. So we could see that meeting as soon as next week.
That was Wendy Benjaminson. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us today on Balance of Power. We're now joined by Rebecca Grant, who is the vice president of the Lexington Institute and an expert in the areas of Russia and Ukraine. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. We want to get into this whole question of the security guarantees and whether this is something that would be toothsome enough to get Ukraine to actually come to the bargaining table with Russia, and what these security guarantees would have to look like from their point of view.
Yes, the security guarantees are Zelenskyy's number one concern. And of course, the most interesting item we've heard is the potential Article 5 style guarantee between several European nations and maybe the U.S. and Ukraine. That, as you know, is in NATO's Article 5 is the mutual self-defense part of this. But the reality is that this security guarantee is going to take not only the pledges, but a lot of weapons, most of which Trump already has in the works. So, 2 Patriot batteries from Germany going down to Ukraine, the continued sale of U.S. weapons, the participation of NATO partners, because there will still be a nearly 800-mile front to defend to contain Russia, and then also to contain Russia's activities in the Black Sea, where Ukraine has done a fantastic job. So expect a lot of military hardware to be in the mix for these security guarantees.
Well, Rebecca, earlier this year, we saw the United Kingdom and also France propose this idea that there would be some sort of security guarantee led by Europe, but then backed up by the United States. And that could include reassurance forces, air cover, things like that. Is that where you see this sort of guarantee trending towards? Or could we see perhaps a more wide-ranging one like the one that Mike was talking about, something similar to Article 5 without actual NATO membership?
I would say all of the above. And you're so smart to raise the air piece, because this security guarantee in operation will have to be what the military calls multi-domain. So Ukraine already shares NATO cyber awareness. And of course, Elon Musk has used Starlink there. But this is going to take a lot of air power as well. Britain and France have talked about potentially putting peacekeepers on the ground, which really gets Putin's back up. But if there is some territory to be traded, the number one job will be making sure that that is done in a safe and secure manner as Russian forces and Ukrainian forces retrograde in the battle space. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some peacekeeping observers or forces there on the ground. But longer term, this is really going to be about air defense, cyber domain control, and of course controlling that land front and keeping the Russian fleet bottled up in the Black Sea, which Ukraine has done so well.
Rebecca, do you see the U.S. taking any direct role in enforcing those security guarantees, say with boots on the ground? The president and Steve Witkoff indicated a little bit more openness to this, but it's unclear whether that would be more than an advisory role. What's your take on it?
Well, first off, that will be up to President Zelenskyy, who, for the record, has never requested U.S. or NATO boots on the ground. The U.S. role here will be absolutely essential in overall command and control and playing a role in training of Ukrainian forces, which we've already seen NATO and the U.S. partners do. What the specifics of it look like, that's going to be yet another thing for Zelenskyy to decide, because he will have to invite any forces into his country.
And Rebecca, we went from hearing talks go from a ceasefire to talks that they want a full peace deal. We had Secretary of State Marco Rubio over the weekend in an interview say that one of the problems with a ceasefire approach is that a ceasefire has to be maintained. And it doesn't seem like Russia is coming to the table in a meaningful way to agree to a ceasefire, a pause in the fighting. What's the strategic reason here to push for a finalized deal, foregoing a ceasefire? Is this creating urgency, or is this Russia just buying time at this point?
Well, best case, I think, because the ceasefires just haven't worked. We've been close to ceasefires a couple times this spring, and then there went Putin unleashing, 500 drones and Iskander missiles right back into Ukraine, luckily Ukraine shooting them down. But that was a big reversal coming out of Alaska, and I think Trump is seeing there is momentum for an actual possible peace deal. And I think Rubio was very realistic about how tough this was all going to be, but they're willing to try for that whole peace deal at this point. And then, of course, the issue, like you said, is will Russia truly respect it when they tell them to, hey, stop shooting?
Rebecca, what does success look like from today for European leaders and then for Volodymyr Zelenskyy as they go to meet with Donald Trump?
Well, for Europe, it's just one thing, and that is to deter Russia. Russia has rearmed. They're on track to replace all their losses in Ukraine. And Putin has that economy on a wartime footing with the 100% backup of China, which is terrible. So the Europeans, no matter what comes out of this meeting or the peace process, Europe will be defending against Russia and Putin for the long term. So they want to make sure that Ukraine can be a viable part of that defense. For Ukraine, a viable state, a viable economy, sovereignty, and a path forward. I'd like to see every Russian out of Ukraine, but we're really hearing that de facto line of control will be there.
Right, exactly, Rebecca. And as you're speaking for our radio listeners and those joining us on Bloomberg television, we're seeing the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy get out of his car, shake President Trump's hand.
President Trump, sir, your
Let's listen
to the
in.
people of Ukraine as world leaders gathered here today. If Russia continues Russia continues to attack civilians in Kharkiv, killing many.
Is there a just option peace on the table? Will you see land to Russia?
All right. That was Ukrainian President Zelenskyy pulling up to the White House, shaking President Trump's hand. He was asked what his message was to the people of Ukraine, and President Trump responded, quote, "We love them." Of course, this is a big, big day. It's hard to underestimate how high stakes this meeting is, as now Ukrainian President Zelenskyy is inside the White House, Mike, alongside half a dozen European leaders who have also traveled here to Washington on short notice to show their support.
And it was notable that President Donald Trump only came out of the White House to greet Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The other European leaders were greeted by other administration officials as their cars pulled up, at least from what we could see outside. And really, the stakes could not be higher, especially for Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who is viewing this moment as perhaps an existential one for his country.
A really important moment. And Rebecca, I want to bring you back into this conversation, as now the leaders are there at the White House. They are getting these talks underway. I'd love to get your perspective here on those other leaders that are there beyond the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. We have some that President Trump has relatively warm relations with, as we've been discussing here on Balance of Power, like the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. What do you make of the optics now that we have all of these European allies in the same room for these discussions?
Bigger than the Alaska summit. Look at the ceremony, the location in the Capitol, and these leaders. So I'm very impressed. We see Keir Starmer from Britain, Britain has led the way all along in support for Ukraine and in greenlighting the use of longer range weapons. Emmanuel Macron, very central. Of course, Friedrich Merz, very important, as I mentioned, German Patriot batteries going down to Ukraine. These are the European power players. Very important that we have Finland's President Stubb there as well. That's a long border between Finland and Russia. Finland would never have joined NATO without this rising Russian threat that they've seen and changing that policy of neutrality. So these are the players, and along with Italy and Giorgia Meloni, and of course, Mark Rutte, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, so smart in keeping this group together. And he's the NATO Secretary General that got NATO to 5%. These are the European power players. Putin is watching. Xi Jinping in China is rushing, because all those leaders know that Xi Jinping cannot be trusted either. They know who's responsible for keeping Russia in this war. So this is the group that can give Ukraine the security guarantees, the economic deals, and for true, powerful deterrence against Russia going forward. It's the right players in the room.
Rebecca, when it comes to actually reaching some sort of a final deal, Donald Trump has floated this idea of lands swaps and giving back some territory giving some territory over to Russia that Russia has taken from Ukraine. In what universe do you see Volodymyr Zelenskyy actually accepting that as part of these discussions, either now or down the road?
Yeah, maybe the universe that is convened there in the White House. Mark Rutte has talked about it as though it's a de facto recognition, but not a de jure. You know, that will still be recognized as part of Ukraine, but under Russian control. Nobody likes this, but there we are. The most painful part, possibly, if they are asked to give up territory in Donetsk province that Ukraine has held, such as the city of Kramatorsk. But we are looking at this as a possibility. I think it does put Zelenskyy in a tough position. But I remind you of two things. One, he was elected in 2019 to try to bring about a peace agreement after the 2014 invasion and the continued fighting and loss of life there. And also, it's very important now to think about rebuilding Ukraine. And Trump has put together, I think, what he has called a really good deal. This should be an excellent deal. And I hope it's enough that Zelenskyy can take it and, as they say, end the war at the negotiating table rather than on the battlefield.
President Trump in the Oval Office alongside Ukrainian President Zelenskyy for a high-stakes meeting here In Washington, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Tyler Kendall alongside Bloomberg's Michael Shepard. In Washington, Joe Matthew is off. Our top story today, this big meeting in the Oval Office. The pair started their remarks by shaking each other's hands, a much warmer reception than we saw the last time that Zelenskyy was in the Oval Office earlier this year. And for our radio listeners, Zelenskyy was wearing a suit. We mention it because that was something that was a point of contention the last time he was at the White House, and perhaps will be a memorable visual from today's meeting. Now, President Trump said that if everything works out today, there will be a trilateral meeting coming soon that would be between the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, President Trump, and Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying that there's a, quote, reasonable chance of ending the war if that meeting happens. Now, Mike, on security guarantees, which is one of the top issues today, President Trump said that the U.S. will be involved, but he declined to give specifics on exactly what that would look like.
Yeah, he was reluctant to get any further about what those security guarantees would look like. We did hear from some of his advisors over the weekend about the possible shape, but again, how much money that would involve. Would it involve U.S. advisors on the ground? And of course, his counterpart, the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, sitting alongside him. Obviously, a very different dynamic to this meeting today, Tyler, than the one we saw several months ago, the meeting that really just devolved into almost a shouting match between the two men. We didn't see any other members of the president's team interject. It was really the focus on the two men. President Donald Trump did say that he would be speaking with Vladimir Putin later after he concludes his conversations with Zelenskyy and with European leaders as well.
Right, an important development, an important part about the next steps here, which is where we want to begin by bringing in our next guest. We're joined now by retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He's the former commanding general for U.S. Army Europe. General Hodges, thanks so much for being here. I want to get your reaction to what we just heard from President Trump. He says that he will be speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin after he has this high-stakes talks today, not just with the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, but also about half a dozen European leaders who have also come here to the White House. How can we measure success today? What are the increments that we should be looking for as these meetings get going?
Well, I have to say that based on the president's record of not following through on any threats to increase pressure on Russia with sanctions or other measures, nothing that's said, I think, can be really counted on until we see action. I do expect that the European leaders who have turned up for this are there because they're worried that the president of the United States is going to abandon Ukraine or somehow put all the blame on Ukraine if there's not some sort of a deal. If the president were to say, you know, Vladimir Putin, get your troops out of Ukraine, which he has never said, by the way, neither he or the Secretary of State have never said the Russians should leave Ukraine, not one time, that would be a significant shift.
General Hodges, what has been the reaction in Europe, a region where you have spent some key parts of your career? What has been the reaction in Europe among your former counterparts and others in the area to the summit on Friday, and then what we have seen unfold since?
I'd say three things. First of all, they are aghast and in disbelief that the president of the United States has treated President Putin the way he has, and that he does the Kremlin's bidding. I mean, almost verbatim on some of the talking points. That most Europeans are dumbfounded that this is what's happening after decades of American leadership in European security through NATO, but also deterring the Soviet Union and then Russia. That they can't believe it. The second thing, the reaction is, of course, an acknowledgement by most Europeans that they have failed over the last 3 decades to do what they should do, to be strong militarily, to deter Russia, and to have to perhaps do something without strong American support. That's in the industry side, the nuclear deterrence, they were very late in cutting their dependence on Russian oil, which made them very vulnerable, of course. And then the third thing I would say is Europe is probably going to be forced into doing something they've talked about, which is to accept more responsibility, this sovereignty, if you will. And in the long run, I think we in the United States are going to regret that Europe will not be as dependent on us. It's going to hurt us economically as well as in a security standpoint.
And General, to follow up on the difference between Europe and the U.S. here when it comes to Ukraine now under Donald Trump, the president is now skipping over the step of obtaining a ceasefire before actually reaching a peace deal that would last. The Europeans have pushed for a ceasefire first. What is the significance of skipping over this step? How are we to read it, and who does it favor?
Well, I think it favors the Russians. The fact is, nobody in Europe and probably most serious people in the United States know that Russia cannot be trusted to live up to any agreement, let alone a ceasefire. To have an effective ceasefire, there has to be some kind of enforcement mechanism. And so here is where I think Europe could convey to the President of the United States that if the U.S. would call for this and the U.S. would help with some things such as intelligence and maybe logistics, that the Europeans would shoulder the burden for enforcing a ceasefire. But instead, they have agreed or given in to Putin's demand that no NATO troops of any type can be on the ground in Ukraine. That's not a decision for the Kremlin to make, but that's how we are acting, as if they do have that right to make that demand. I think that the idea of going straight to some kind of a peace settlement, the danger is that, again, nobody trusts the Russians. There's no record of Russia living up to any agreement unless they were forced to do it. And so I think this is why, and even Secretary Rubio, up until just a few weeks ago, he talked consistently about the need for a ceasefire to stop the killing, but also to build trust and confidence that Russia would actually live up to an agreement. Look at what Russia did last night. They killed another 7 Ukrainian civilians with incendiary bombs dropped on top of an apartment building the night before this meeting is supposed to happen. And then you've got Russian bombers flying out in the Barents Sea close to Alaska. These are not signs of a Russian government that is really, really wanting to have a negotiated settlement that's acceptable to all.
Right. And General, I'm glad that you brought up Secretary of State Marco Rubio, because he actually did say in one of his interviews over the weekend that one of the issues with a ceasefire is that you have to enforce it. And perhaps that's starting to be some of the messaging that we've seen out of the White House. And another area where the Secretary of State was pressed on, President Trump was pressed on in the Oval Office, is exactly what those security guarantees are going to look like if they do move to a peace deal. And I would love to get your thoughts here on exactly what the Europeans are going to be pushing for, because we have seen a range of options perhaps floated on the table, such as the UK and France earlier this year proposing a plan that would see reassurance forces, air cover, things like that. What, in your view, is realistic, and what do you expect our allies to really be pushing for that they think they could get when it comes to guarantees from the United States?
Well, if I may, of course, Secretary Rubio was correct to say that a ceasefire would require enforcement, but so would a peace settlement. I mean, there is nobody in Europe trusts Russia to do what they say they'll do unless they're forced to. So whether we go to ceasefire or go directly to some sort of an agreement, does anybody seriously believe that Russia will live up to it? There's no record of them doing that anywhere. But let's go to the point of your question of what would a enforcement or what would security guarantees look like. Obviously, I'll say what many have said is that NATO is the best security guarantee. These things that Mr. Witkoff has said about a NATO-like or a NATO-style guarantee, what a meaningless statement. I mean, what does he mean by NATO-like? That means an attack on Ukraine would be considered like an attack on the U.S.
All right. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commanding general for U.S. Army Europe. Thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg. Make sure to join us later for the late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Bloomberg Business Week is up next.